The world knows the Beatles as the Fab Four, but history has the number wrong, because in the first days of their legend there were five. His name was Stuart Sutcliffe, the fifth member. He gave the Beatles 2 years of his life, and in return he received nothing. No number one hits, no fortune, no fame, just a headstone at age 21. How could the man John Lennon called his soulmate, the artist who created their name and their image, be so cruelly wiped from the pages of history? This is the story of Stuart Sutcliffe, the original bassist, the forgotten fifth Beatle. But it's not a story about music, nor is it a story about failure. It's a profound tragedy about a fateful choice. When a man is forced to stand between his best friend, the love of his life, and the artist he was born to be. It's a choice that ended not with a gold record, but with a mysterious death that still casts a shadow over the Beatles' legacy. To understand a character as vibrant, as sensitive, and ultimately as tragic as Stuart Sutcliffe, you must first breathe the air of the city that created him. Liverpool, in the 1950s, was a city of stark, dramatic contrasts, a place of deep industrial shadows and surprising flashes of defiant light. It was a tough, gritty, working-class port town, still bearing the very visible and psychological scars of the Second World War. The skyline was a jagged silhouette of cranes and warehouses, the air often thick with the smell of coal smoke and the salty tang of the Irish Sea. Rationing had only recently ended, and a sense of gray austerity hung in the air like a perpetual mist off the River Mersey. For many young people, the future seemed preordained, a life spent on the docks, in the factories, or down the mines, a life of hard, back-breaking labor just like their fathers and grandfathers before them. But Liverpool was also a city with a unique and fiercely independent soul. As one of the world's great ports, it was a gateway to the wider world, a place where new sounds, new fashions, and new ideas washed ashore with every tide. The most important of these imports came courtesy of the Cunard Yanks, the thousands of local men who worked as crewmen on the Grand Cunard Line ocean liners that sailed between Liverpool and New York. They would come home with their suitcases stuffed not just with American clothes and magazines, but with records. Records by artists whose names were barely known in the rest of Britain. Bluesmen like Muddy Waters, country singers like Hank Williams, and, most importantly, the new electrifying sound of rock and roll. For a generation of kids coming of age in this drab post-war world, hearing Elvis Presley, Little Richard, or Gene Vincent for the first time was like a lightning strike. This music was an escape, a jolt of pure technicolor energy in a monochrome world. Out of this environment, a new musical craze was born, skiffle, popularized by Lonnie Donegan's hit Rock Island line. Skiffle was a kind of folk blues hybrid that was incredibly simple to play. All you needed was a cheap acoustic guitar, a washboard for percussion, and a T-chest bass. Suddenly, every kid in Liverpool was in a band. It was a true do-it-yourself musical revolution, a way for working-class teenagers to create their own excitement, their own culture, their own identity. This was the world that Stuart Ferguson Victor Sutcliffe was born into in 1940 in Edinburgh, Scotland. But it was Liverpool, where his family moved when he was 3, that would become his spiritual home. He wasn't a product of the city's toughest slums. He grew up in a respectable middle-class home. His father, Charles, was a senior civil servant who was often away at sea, leaving Stuart to be raised primarily by his mother, Millie. Millie was a school teacher, a strong-willed woman who recognized her son's unique gifts from a very early age and nurtured them with a fierce devotion. But this devotion was not without its own pressures. Millie saw the potential for a truly great professional artist in her son, and her expectations were as intense as her support was strong. Stuart was different. While other boys were kicking footballs in the street, his artistic inclinations were more formally cultivated. He learned the basics of the piano and even sang in the church choir. But his true passion was discovered in the solitude of his sketchbooks, which he filled with drawings that showed a maturity and an understanding of form and shadow far beyond his years. He was quiet, introspective, and possessed a natural, almost ethereal sense of style. He was handsome, but in a delicate, brooding way that set him apart. He was, from the beginning, an artist. His talent was undeniable, and it led him to the natural destination for a young man of his sensibilities, the Liverpool College of Art. In the late 1950s, the Art College was a bohemian oasis in the heart of the gritty city. It was a place where ideas were currency, where eccentricity was celebrated, and where the rigid class structures of post-war Britain seemed to dissolve. Here Stuart found his tribe. He blossomed not just as a student but as an artist. He devoured the work of the abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, and was drawn to the dark emotional intensity of European painters like Edvard Munch. His own work was bold, ambitious, and deeply impressive. He painted on huge canvases, using thick layers of paint mixed with sand and other materials to create textured, brooding landscapes of the mind. His tutors, including the renowned pop art pioneer Edoardo Paolozzi, recognized that they were in the presence of a rare and prodigious talent. They saw in him the potential for a brilliant future, a career as one of Britain's great modern painters. He was the undisputed star of the college, a young man radiating a quiet, confident cool. Music, for Stuart, was something he appreciated, something that was part of the bohemian background noise of his life, but it was not his passion. His soul belonged to the canvas. At that very same college, another young man was making a different kind of noise. His name was John Lennon. If Stuart was the college's quiet prince, John was its court jester and its resident terrorist. He was everything Stuart was not: loud, aggressive, bitingly sarcastic, and overflowing with a raw, untamed energy. He was a rock and roll rebel, a teddy boy in disguise who saw art college not as a place of learning, but as a stage for his constant chaotic performance. He had formed a skiffle group called the Quarrymen with some school friends, and their sound was as rough and undisciplined as he was. But beneath the swagger, the cruel jokes, and the tough guy facade, John Lennon was a young man forged in trauma. His father had abandoned him, and his mother, Julia, had given him up to be raised by his stern but loving Aunt Mimi. Julia's sudden, violent death, hit by a car when John was just 17, was a wound that would never fully heal. This crucible of loss and abandonment left him with a deep-seated insecurity and a desperate, almost pathological need for a strong, loyal, and intellectually stimulating partner. He was searching for a kindred spirit, an alter ego, who could understand his restless soul. And then he met Stuart Sutcliffe. Their friendship was immediate, intense, and magnetic. They were introduced by a mutual friend, Bill Harry, who would later found the influential Mersey Beat music paper. John, the insecure rebel, was utterly captivated by Stuart. He was mesmerized by Stu's effortless cool, his quiet confidence, and most of all, by his staggering artistic talent. He would look at Stu's portfolio of paintings with a sense of genuine awe. Here was someone who wasn't just pretending to be an artist. He was one. For Stuart, John was equally fascinating. He saw past the aggressive exterior to the sharp, brilliant mind beneath. He was drawn to John's raw energy, his defiant spirit, and his absolute commitment to the new, rebellious religion of rock and roll. They became inseparable, a perfect fusion of complementary energies. Their bond was so all-consuming that it has forever been shrouded in a layer of mystery, a connection so intense that it defied easy labels and led some in their inner circle and many biographers since to quietly question if their relationship went beyond that of brothers or even soulmates. They were two sides of the same coin. John, the raw force of nature, and Stu, the sophisticated intellectual artist. They moved into a cramped, squalid apartment at 3 Gambier Terrace with another art student, a place that would become the first Beatle flat. It was a den of bohemian chaos, the floors littered with empty beer bottles, art supplies, and overflowing ashtrays. Here, they would spend endless hours talking, arguing, and dreaming. They debated the merits of French existentialist philosophers, dissected the lyrics of Chuck Berry, and planned their creative assault on the world. It was in one of these conversations inspired by Buddy Holly's band, the Crickets, that they came up with a name for John's fledgling band. They toyed with a pun, finally landing on the Beatles, a name that would soon be refined to the Beatles. John's band was getting better. They had recruited a phenomenally talented young guitarist named Paul McCartney, who in turn brought in his even younger school friend, George Harrison. The musical core was solidifying, but John wanted more than just a friend on the sidelines. He wanted Stuart in his band. He became obsessed with the idea. To John, a band wasn't just about the music. It was about the image, the attitude, the gang. Stuart had the look. He had the soul of a poet and the cheekbones of a movie star. He was the missing piece of the puzzle. There was just one seemingly insurmountable problem. Stuart Sutcliffe couldn't play a single musical instrument. This is where the first tragic choice of Stuart's life was made, a choice born of an intense and complicated friendship. Torn between his own clear, promising artistic path and his deep loyalty to his charismatic best friend, Stuart eventually, reluctantly gave in. The conflict was not a simple one. He loved John, and he was undeniably drawn to the raw, thrilling energy of the rock and roll world. In 1959, he submitted one of his large, dark, abstract canvases to the prestigious John Moores exhibition in Liverpool. To the astonishment of many, the painting was not only accepted but was purchased by John Moores himself for the sum of 90 guineas, a small fortune for a student at the time. A sensible artist, a man committed to his craft, would have taken that money and reinvested it in his future. More canvases, better paints, perhaps a trip to see the great galleries of London or Paris. It was a validation of his talent, a clear signpost pointing toward a successful career in the art world. But John Lennon's influence was a powerful gravitational force. He saw that money not as a means for Stuart to further his art, but as a way for Stuart to join his gang. He was relentless. Under John's constant, almost bullying persuasion, Stuart Sutcliffe did the unthinkable. He took the prize money from his greatest artistic triumph, a validation of his true calling, and sacrificed it on the altar of friendship. The canvas was traded for a bass guitar. The artist bought the tools of a trade he did not know. It was a beautiful instrument, but in his hands it was a prop. It was a profound symbolic act, a sacrifice of his true calling on the altar of friendship. The artist had bought the tools of a musician, a trade he did not know, and for which he had no natural aptitude. He didn't know it then, but this single decision, made out of love and loyalty, had set him on a new and dangerous path. It was a path that would lead him to the heart of a musical revolution, to the arms of a great love, and ultimately to his own tragic premature end. The band now had its bassist, the one who looked the part perfectly, even if he couldn't yet play it. Their next destination in August 1960 was Hamburg, a city of sin and redemption on the German coast that would become a trial by fire, that would shape the band's legend and seal Stuart's fate. For the 5 young men from Liverpool who tumbled out of Alan Williams' cramped van, it was another world entirely. This wasn't the familiar gritty landscape of home. It was the Reeperbahn, a neon-drenched artery of sin and sound, a place where the lines between pleasure and danger were perpetually blurred. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, cheap perfume, and frying sausages. The streets were a river of humanity. Drunken sailors on shore leave, sharp-suited gangsters, and the shadowy figures of prostitutes who watched from dimly lit doorways. This was their new home, their new stage, and their crucible. They had been hired to play at a club called the Indra, a seedy second-rate establishment that was more of a strip joint than a music venue. Their living quarters were a shock. 2 small, windowless, and squalid rooms behind the screen of the Bambino, a nearby cinema. The conditions were appalling, but they had little time to dwell on them. Their contract demanded a performance of staggering endurance. They were expected to play for hours on end, night after night, to a crowd that was often indifferent, sometimes hostile, and almost always drunk. Their job was to be the loud human jukebox that kept the beer flowing. John Lennon, with his characteristic black humor, would later describe their directive from the club owner: "Mach schau, Engländer, make a show." And so they did. Fueled by a steady diet of cheap amphetamines known as preludin and the raw, desperate energy of youth, they transformed themselves on that tiny stage. They stomped, they screamed, they pounded on their instruments until their fingers bled and their voices were raw. They were a primal force, a chaotic explosion of sound that was a world away from the polite 15-minute sets of the Liverpool ballrooms. This nightly trial by fire forged them into something new. It burned away their amateurism. It hammered them into a tight, ferocious powerhouse of a live band. It was here, in this pressure cooker, that the cracks in Stuart Sutcliffe's place within the band began to show, and the battle for his soul truly began. On stage, the conflict was musical. While John, Paul, and George were growing exponentially as musicians, their confidence and skill expanding with every 8-hour set, Stuart was struggling to keep up. He was an artist, a man of ideas and images, not a natural musician. His bass playing was rudimentary, often consisting of just the root notes, and his timing could be shaky under pressure. The friction had a name: Paul McCartney. To Paul's prodigious musical ear, a wrong note wasn't a mistake, it was an insult. Stuart was not a bandmate, he was an anchor, and Paul was determined to cut the rope. He saw Stuart's limitations not as a charming quirk, but as an anchor holding the band back. The criticism was constant, sometimes delivered as a helpful suggestion, other times as a sharp cutting remark barked across the stage in the middle of a song. In the cramped, tense atmosphere of their shared living space, these musical disagreements would often spill over into bitter arguments. Stuart, quiet and sensitive by nature, would retreat into a defensive shell, while Paul, driven by his own insecurities and a fierce desire for the band to be the absolute best, would press the attack. John Lennon, fiercely loyal and still deeply under Stuart's spell, played the role of protector. He would jump to his friend's defense, telling Paul to back off, his words a shield against the musical criticism. But even John was growing frustrated. He was the leader, and he could hear what Paul was hearing. His dream of leading the toughest, most authentic rock and roll band in the world was being audibly hampered by his best friend's inability to master his instrument. So he created a defense, an armor of cool. On stage, he would often turn his back to the crowd. What the audience saw as enigmatic style was in reality an act of shame, a desperate attempt to hide his fumbling hands from view. With his sharp cheekbones, his ever-present dark sunglasses, and a posture that radiated a kind of poetic melancholy, he looked more like a star than any of them. He was the visual anchor, the silent, brooding poet in a gang of noisy rockers. But the tension was undeniable. The friendship, once a pure source of creative energy in the bohemian calm of art college, was now being tested by the harsh professional demands of the Reeperbahn. Stuart was an artist in a rocker's world, a man of the canvas forced to work with the blunt instrument of the bass, and the strain was beginning to carve new, worried lines into his handsome face. He was, for the first time, truly losing his way. And then one night, amidst the noise, the chaos, and the growing sense of alienation, a different world walked into the Kaiserkeller, the larger club they had graduated to. This world came in the form of two people, Klaus Voormann, a young German artist and designer, and his girlfriend, a striking and intensely intelligent photographer named Astrid Kirchherr. They were not the usual Kaiserkeller crowd. They were Exes, as the local rockers called them, a clique of sophisticated, black-clad existentialists who were devotees of French philosophy, avant-garde art, and cool jazz. They had heard about the savage, primitive energy of this new English band and had come, half slumming, half genuinely curious, to see what all the fuss was about. What they saw transfixed them. They were mesmerized by the raw, untamed power of the music, the sheer visceral energy that poured off the stage. But their artistic eyes were drawn to one figure in particular, not the charismatic leader John or the boyishly handsome Paul. They were drawn to the bassist who stood in the shadows, his face a mask of detached concentration. They saw in Stuart Sutcliffe a kindred spirit. He didn't look like the others. He had an artist's sensitivity, a quiet intensity that seemed to belong more to a Parisian cafe than a German beer hall. As Klaus would later recall, he was the one who looked interesting. The connection was immediate and profound. Astrid, bold and confident, approached the band after their set. She spoke English fluently, and her intelligence and exotic European charm were a world away from the screaming teenage girls they were used to. An invitation was extended for a photo shoot. The resulting photographs are now legendary. In the stark, dramatic black and white of Astrid's lens, the band was transformed. She stripped away their rough, amateurish image and saw them as they wanted to be seen, as dangerous, romantic, rock and roll anti-heroes. Her photos, taken in abandoned fairgrounds and gritty back alleys, were the first to capture the true mythic potential of the Beatles. But during those photo shoots, a deeper connection was being forged. The bond between Stuart and Astrid was like a magnetic force. It wasn't just love, it was recognition. In him, she found the brooding artist she had always searched for. In her, he found the artistic sanctuary he so desperately needed. She saw past the clumsy bass player and saw the brilliant, soul-searching painter beneath. Their love affair blossomed away from the sweaty stages and the amphetamine-fueled nights. In the quiet, creative sanctuary of her mother's attic apartment, it was a space filled with art books, photographs, and the cool, cerebral sounds of modern jazz. Here, they could speak their own language, the language of art, of ideas, of feeling. For the first time since leaving the familiar world of art college, Stuart felt he was home. This new, all-consuming love became the central battleground for his soul, and for his fracturing friendship with John Lennon. Astrid, the artist, began to sculpt Stuart, her new muse. She saw his greased-back teddy boy hairstyle as a crude American cliché. She convinced him to wash the grease out and comb his hair forward, down onto his forehead. The result was a soft, androgynous, instantly iconic look, the haircut that would become the visual trademark of the Beatles, the haircut that would define an entire generation. At first, the other Beatles, particularly John and Paul, ridiculed him relentlessly. They called him a German art student, a traitor to their working-class rocker roots. But their insults were tinged with a grudging admiration. Soon, George tried the style, then Paul. John, ever the rebel, was the last to hold out, but eventually he too succumbed. Astrid's artistic vision had given them their look. John watched this transformation with a toxic mixture of fascination and intense, simmering jealousy. Stuart was not only slipping away from him musically, but he was now being physically and aesthetically shaped by this new, powerful female influence. The intimate, all-male world he and Stu had shared, the gang he had so desperately wanted Stuart to be a part of, was now occupied by a third person. Astrid wasn't just a girlfriend, she was a rival. The competition for Stuart's soul was on. The conflict escalated, becoming more open and more vicious. John's onstage mockery of Stu's playing became more frequent, his jokes more personal and cruel. It was the desperate lashing out of a man terrified of being abandoned, a primal fear rooted in his own traumatic childhood. For John, Stuart was more than a friend. He was an anchor, an intellectual equal who validated his own artistic pretensions. Astrid was threatening to cut that anchor loose. In the middle of this emotional tug-of-war, a shadowy event occurred that has been debated by historians and biographers ever since. The exact date and details are lost to the fog of memory and conflicting accounts, but the legend persists. After a gig, a violent brawl broke out. Stuart, ever loyal to his friends, was in the thick of it. In the melee, he was kicked viciously in the head, his skull hitting a brick wall with sickening force. He was dazed and in immense pain, but in the chaotic, tough guy world of Hamburg, he simply shook it off. The incident was quickly forgotten, but in the months that followed, the blinding headaches began, and a question that haunts his legacy to this day took form. Had a fatal clock started ticking that night? By the summer of 1961, Stuart Sutcliffe had reached his breaking point. He was living a schizophrenic existence. By night, he was the reluctant bassist in the world's greatest bar band, enduring the criticism of his bandmates and the escalating psychological warfare with his best friend. By day, he was an artist in love, living in a world of intellectual stimulation and profound emotional connection. The two halves of his life were pulling him apart. He was a gifted painter being ridiculed for being a bad musician. He was caught between the possessive, demanding love of his best friend and the liberating, artistic love of the woman he had asked to be his wife. Within a few short months of meeting, he and Astrid had become engaged, a formal declaration of his commitment to her and the new life she represented. He knew he could not continue to live in both worlds. He had to make a choice. In the summer of 1961, Stuart Sutcliffe stood at the absolute center of a perfect storm of his own making. By night, he was the basis for the Beatles, a band whose raw power and charisma were becoming the stuff of legend on the Reeperbahn. But the stage had become a place of torment, a nightly reminder of his musical limitations and the fracturing of his most important friendship. By day, he was an artist reborn, living in a world of intellectual and emotional fulfillment with Astrid Kirchherr, the woman who saw his true soul. The two halves of his life were no longer sustainable. They were pulling him apart. The constant criticism from Paul, the possessive, wounded jealousy from John, and the grueling amphetamine-fueled schedule were eroding his spirit. In contrast, the quiet sanctuary of Astrid's apartment, the smell of oil paints, and the thrill of rediscovering his own artistic voice offered a vision of a different, more authentic life. He knew a choice had to be made. It was a choice between two loves, two futures, two identities. In July of that year, he made a choice that would seal his fate and alter music history. The choice was simple. He quit the band. He chose the woman. He chose the canvas. He approached the band and told them his decision was final. In a gesture that was both practical and profoundly symbolic, he offered his precious Hofner bass guitar to Paul McCartney. Paul, a left-hander, would have to restring it to play it properly, a final, awkward reminder of how ill-suited the instrument had been for Stuart all along. And with that, he walked away from the band that was on the very brink of conquering the world. The news was a devastating blow to John Lennon. It was far more than losing a bassist. It was a personal and profound breakup. The gang was being broken up, and the person leaving was his other half. The confrontation, according to those who witnessed the fallout, was emotionally volcanic. In a fit of rage and pain born from his deepest fears of abandonment, John accused Stuart of betrayal, of weakness, of throwing everything away for a girl. But beneath the anger, there was a grudging, painful understanding. John, the artist, knew that his friend was an artist too. He knew that Stu's heart was never truly in the relentless beat of rock and roll. Years later, his anger would soften into a sad resignation. "I was sick," John would recall, "but he was right to leave. He'd found his woman, and he wanted to paint." Stuart Sutcliffe was finally returning to his true self. For a brief, beautiful period in late 1961 and early 1962, Stuart's life was filled with a joy and creative purpose he had never known. The choice had been made, and it felt unequivocally right. He and Astrid were deeply in love, planning their future together. He formally enrolled as a postgraduate student at the Hamburg College of Art, securing a prestigious scholarship intended for foreign students. Here, he was no longer the struggling musician, but the star pupil. His new mentor was the Scottish artist Edoardo Paolozzi, a future pioneer of the pop art movement, who was then a guest professor at the college. Paolozzi saw in Stuart a rare and powerful talent. He would later describe his student as one of the most brilliant and promising he had ever taught, hailing his work for its depth and emotional intensity. Finally, free from the demands of the band, Stuart painted with a feverish, obsessive energy. His work from this period is a stunning display of a talent in full bloom. He moved away from pure abstraction and began to incorporate haunting, ghost-like figures into his canvases. His style a powerful fusion of European expressionism and American abstract force. He was happy. He was in love. He was making the art he was born to make. He was finally on the right path, living the life he had sacrificed for his friend's dream. He was, at last, home. But a seed of tragedy planted in the violence of a Hamburg brawl was beginning to sprout inside his skull. At first there were headaches. Then the pain became a blinding, unpredictable storm. They were no longer a dull ache, but excruciating, blinding waves of pain that would come without warning. They would often strike in the middle of a class, forcing him to clutch his head in agony, his vision blurring. Sometimes the pain was so intense he would collapse. He became increasingly sensitive to light, often wearing his dark sunglasses even indoors. His once cheerful demeanor was now punctuated by moments of sudden, violent mood swings and deep, inexplicable depression. The vibrant young artist was now living in a world of constant, terrifying, and undiagnosed pain. Astrid, frantic with worry, took him to see the best doctors in Hamburg. They ran tests, they took x-rays, but they could find nothing physically wrong. They diagnosed him with a nervous condition, a psychological ailment brought on by stress. They prescribed tranquilizers, but the pain only grew worse. A German doctor, sensing something was gravely wrong, advised him to return to England for more specialized tests, but for reasons lost to history, Stuart never went. Perhaps he was afraid of what they might find, or perhaps, in his weakened state, the journey itself seemed too daunting. He tried to hide the severity of his condition from Astrid, not wanting to burden her, but his art told the truth. His paintings from this final period are haunting and difficult to look at. The colors become darker, the brushstrokes more frantic and violent. They are the work of a man fighting a losing war inside his own head, a desperate attempt to exorcise a physical agony that had no name. The end came with a shocking and heartbreaking suddenness. On April 10th, 1962, the Beatles, John, Paul, and George, were flying from London to Hamburg. They were returning to the city that had made them, this time not as a struggling bar band, but as rising stars with a record contract, ready to headline at the New Star Club. They were expecting to see their old friend, to catch up, perhaps to see his new paintings. That same morning, Stuart was at home with Astrid when he suffered another collapse. This one was different. He was writhing in agony. Astrid, terrified, called an ambulance. She held him in her arms on the frantic race to the hospital, whispering that everything would be all right. It was a promise she couldn't keep. He died in her arms before they ever made it through the hospital doors. The official cause of death was a cerebral hemorrhage, a burst aneurysm in his brain. He was only 21 years old. Stuart's death didn't just close a life. It was the beginning of an inconsolable grief for those who loved him. The first shock of that loss hit the Beatles as soon as they landed back in the city. What greeted them at Hamburg Airport was not the embrace of their old friend, but the devastating and unbelievable news of his death, delivered by a grief-stricken Astrid. The timing was almost surreally cruel. John Lennon, a man who had built a fortress of cynicism and sarcasm to protect his fragile heart, completely shattered. He couldn't process the loss. He began laughing hysterically, a terrifying manic laughter that was a mask for a grief too profound to comprehend. He didn't attend the funeral, unable to face the finality of it. Astrid would later recall him breaking down in her apartment, weeping uncontrollably and screaming, "I'm the one who's going to die soon, not Stu." For the rest of his life, John was haunted by the grief and the unspoken guilt over his friend's death, the friend he had pushed into a world that may have contributed to his end. Astrid Kirchherr, the great love of Stuart's life, was left a widow before she was ever a wife, her world shattered, her future stolen. She was left with a broken heart and a collection of powerful, haunting paintings, the final brilliant testament of the man she loved. The prince had been lost, his promise unfulfilled, his great work left unfinished. Stuart Sutcliffe is the ghost in the machine of the world's greatest band. Though his name isn't on the records, his influence is hidden in plain sight. He was their aesthetic architect, giving them their name, their intellectual edge, and the iconic look that defined Beatlemania. He was the artistic soulmate who pushed John Lennon from being a rocker into becoming an artist. His story is the ultimate what-if of rock history. He possessed the rare courage to walk away from unimaginable fame, choosing his own path of art and love over his best friend's dream. But in a cruel twist, the brain aneurysm that took his life, its cause still debated, denied him the time to live out that beautiful choice. He was not a failed Beatle. He was a brilliant artist on the verge of his own greatness. His legacy is not a footnote. It is the ghost in the machine. He is the quiet heartbreak that echoes beneath the triumphant noise of the world's greatest band, the haunting reminder of the prince they first crowned and then left behind.